special events that we've done. So I would like to officially welcome you after David did as well. We're thrilled to have Sara Fitzgerald here. Sara's got such an interesting background and continues to have an interesting life and interesting accomplishments. She's a journalist and award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction. By the way, she's not the Sara Fitzgerald that's in My Sister's Keeper, either the movie or the book. So just want to let you know that. The bulk of her career has been as an editor and reporter. She spent 15 years at the Washington Post and also at other significant newspapers around the country, the St. Petersburg Times, the Miami Herald, the Akron Beacon Journal. She was also the first editor of the electronic version of the Post in 1980. So she boasts that she's a qualifying member of Facebook group, I Was Online Before You Were Born. So she's moved on, and she's now contributing in the realm of being an author, and that's what we're going to hear about today. Her three key books that are all about women and little-known women, but that captured her imagination, and she's then will tell us what about them was so interesting. I also want to mention that she has a website, sarafitzgerald.com, so do check out more about Sara there. So with that, I will introduce Sara. Sara?
Thank you, Louise. Thank you all for joining me today on what I believe is a beautiful day where all of us are. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've had many friends who've participated in Encore Learning over the years as both teachers and students. And I think we all agree that one of the great things about these years of our lives is having time to do and learn new things. And in fact, all three of the books I'm going to talk about today were written after I retired. This time of life, I think, also gives us more time to reflect. And I think that's particularly been the case this past year. I delivered the manuscript for the last of these books just over a year ago. And since then, I've had even more time to reflect on what led me to write them. One is a novel, one is a biography, and the newest one is a work of narrative nonfiction. They're all quite different, but they have one thing in common. They all tell the little-known stories of real-life women. And my interest in exploring these stories grew out of my time at the University of Michigan and my studies as a history major. When I discussed this talk with the organizers of Encore Learning, we decided to schedule it immediately after Election Day. I will try to make some points that are pertinent to our current times, but I also hope that for the next 90 minutes, we can all settle in and take a collected deep breath and focus on something other than the drama of the past week. Ironically, I'm speaking to you today from the place where this story begins, Ann Arbor, Michigan, the home of the University of Michigan. This is a photo of me when I was editor of the Michigan Daily in late 1972. You can see how intense I looked back then. I entered Michigan in the fall of 1969 and graduated in 1973. I'm sure many of you attended college around that same time. At the University of Michigan, those years were arguably the most tumultuous time in the school's history. One of my colleagues on the Daily was sports editor John Papanek, who went on to become managing editor of Sports Illustrated and the founding editor of ESPN magazine. In an essay he wrote a few years ago, John did a good job of capturing the mood on campus when the two of us arrived. He wrote, "Thanks to so much of what our upperclassmates had done and gone through during the crucial run-up years of 66 to 68, September 1969 seemed, to us at least, to be the launch date for every kind of freedom imaginable: social, sexual, cultural, musical, academic, pharmaceutical, and nobody could tell us what we could not do, least of all the stuffy university administrators in the brand new big fortress built to house and protect them from us, or the bureaucrats who thought they ran things from Lansing and, for that matter, Washington, D.C. From September through November 69, the university raged and seethed in an endless series of battles, running from cold to very, very hot, between students and administrators, students and landlords, students and other students, students and police, administrators and faculty, townies, and the university community. Robin Fleming was president of Michigan at the time. He was a labor lawyer and mediator by training and achieved some national prominence during those years because he had a reputation for skillfully managing campus protests. 1970 was the year that student protesters were killed at Kent State and Jackson State universities, but Fleming was lucky because Michigan was on a semester break during that particular time. I interviewed one of President Fleming's closest colleagues a year ago, and she said that as educators, it was awful to think that their main job was just to try and keep students alive. In his memoir, Fleming observed that Michigan students had found things to protest all throughout the university's history. But what made this period different, he said, was the unrest in the wider society. Quote, "We were involved in an unpopular war in Vietnam. We were engaged in civil unrest over racial differences, and protesters had learned the advantages inherent in the tactics of civil disobedience. On top of that, our values were changing. There were severe strains on the traditional family structure. Drugs, particularly marijuana, had entered the scene. Premarital sex was no longer the taboo it had once been, and respect and civility were lacking," unquote. The 1969 fall semester began with a sit-in to achieve a student-run bookstore, followed by many anti-war protests. The trial of the Chicago Seven, the subject of a new movie, ran from late September 1969 to mid-February 1970, and was followed closely on my campus. In the spring, Michigan hosted the teach-in that led to the first Earth Day. Then in March of 1970, Black activists, under the umbrella of the Black Action Movement, organized a strike that ended when the university committed to a goal of increasing the percentage of Blacks in the Michigan student body from 3.5% to 10%, their share of the state's population. As an aside, persons of color now represent 35% of the student body, but Blacks still lag behind at only 5%. And what was the climate on campus like for women at that time? Well, the University of Michigan was founded in 1817, but women weren't admitted until 1870. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the admission of Madeleine Stockwell, who is shown here. Throughout much of the university's history, its culture was more like that of an all-male Ivy League school than the land-grant colleges of the Big Ten that were founded later in the 19th century. I think the University of Virginia and Virginia Tech also displayed some of that same kind of difference. I didn't know it at the time, but when I applied to Michigan in late 1968, the admissions committee was enforcing a quota of 55% men, 45% women for the freshman class. In 1970, they openly acknowledged in interviews that they imposed the quota when they realized women were outperforming men in high school, and it appeared to violate their sense of what was right and normal if the freshman class had more women than men. How did this male culture manifest itself on campus? Well, up until 1954, women were not permitted to enter the main student activities building, the Michigan Union, through the front door. Women were not allowed into the billiards room of the Union until 1968. When I arrived on campus in 1969, women faculty members still could not join the Science Research Club, which had been around since 1902. The cheerleaders were all men. Here are some alumni from those days. Women could not play in the Michigan Marching Band. Dogs had just been permitted on the floor of Michigan Stadium, but women were still barred. That barrier was broken by one of my classmates, Sarah Krulwich, a Michigan Daily photographer who went on to a distinguished career at the New York Times and was recently awarded a special Tony Award for her career's work in capturing photographs of Broadway shows. In 1970, the Daily discovered that the M Club of Ann Arbor was holding smokers before football games, but was not inviting the women who were regents or university vice presidents or top sports editors of the Daily. Women on campus were starting to realize that Michigan was awarding graduate degrees to women, but it was hiring very few of them as professors. You could go through 4 years at Michigan without having a single female professor, particularly after the phys ed requirement was abolished in 1968. When I began reviewing the papers of President Fleming in the university's archive, I found a very thoughtful letter that was written in the summer of 1970 by a historian from Bryn Mawr who had just spent a sabbatical year teaching at Michigan. She wrote Fleming, quote, "At Michigan, I have a claustrophobic sense of living in a man's world, despite the fact that the Department of History has been generous but not patronizing. I have missed the companionship of women who share my professional commitments and the problems they bring, and I've become defensive about the professional potential of women who should not need my defense any more than men do. This, of course, is a personal reaction, and I can't deny that I've often enjoyed getting on my soapbox, but until there are more of us, women may not be entirely comfortable on this faculty." She went on to describe her interactions with female graduate students and concluded that, quote, "At Michigan, the students have far too few models to suggest to them the wide range of intellectual and professional choices they can make." She added, "They have only the vaguest ideas about the purpose of women's education in general and their own educations in particular. Despite the career orientation of women's lib, many women will not take up careers even though they are educated in professionally oriented institutions. It seems to me that this is a problem which the university has ignored." 15 years later, this professor, Mary Maples Dunn, would be named president of Smith College. Women like Dunn were beginning to ask questions. Many of them were questioning the roles they had been expected to play in the civil rights movement or in anti-war organizations or within the major political parties. And on college campuses, women faculty members were starting to realize that they were never getting promoted and that they were earning less than their male peers. Some of these women, those who were teaching in the social sciences and humanities, had been advised by their own older male professors or colleagues that women and their issues were not worthy of academic study, but they wanted to study those subjects anyway. They were pioneers in the field of women's studies, and their research interests helped to shape the perspectives of students like me when we pursued our own academic work. Kitty Sklar, an untenured lecturer in the history department, offered a seminar on women's history, and it led me to conduct oral histories with women in my family and to learn things about my grandmother that I had never known. Marian Martsoff, the only woman teaching in the journalism department, wanted to offer a seminar on women in journalism. She was told that she could offer the class, but that she would have to find her own classroom space. So she taught her seminar at night in her own living room. I visited her there again last year. Martsoff realized that journalism historians had failed to tell the stories of women in that profession, and she sought to remedy the situation when she later published a well-reviewed book entitled Up from the Footnote. As I pursued a major in history and had to come up with ideas for term papers, I looked for topics in women's history that had not yet been fully explored. For American intellectual history, I wrote about Margaret Fuller. For my class on 20th century American history, I reviewed the extent to which Edith Wilson had run the White House after President Wilson was incapacitated by his stroke. As my senior year approached, I read Nancy Milford's groundbreaking biography of Zelda Fitzgerald. Milford highlighted Zelda's own creative talents and how her husband seemed to have expropriated her work in his own stories and novels. That inspired me to write my senior thesis on the flapper phenomenon, with Kitty Sklar acting as my thesis advisor. It was during my college years that Ms. Magazine was created, the Equal Rights Amendment cleared Congress, the National Women's Political Caucus was founded, and the Supreme Court issued its decision in Roe v. Wade. And it was during those years that women successfully challenged sex discrimination at Michigan with the help of the federal government. I began covering that story when I was a very junior reporter on the Michigan Daily. By the time I served as its editor and graduated in 1973, I was filled with the conviction that I could be whatever I wanted to be. As the years went by, I discovered that women who were just a few years older than me were not given the same kind of encouragement that I received, and many of them had a much tougher time breaking into new professional fields than I did. So fast forward to 2005. I had worked for much of my career as a journalist, but I'd also had the satisfaction of working with two other men to start a successful consulting firm. That year, we experienced some divisions among our philosophies. Looking back, it was sort of a harbinger of some of the partisan political differences we are now living with. But in any case, our company split up, and at the age of 54, I found myself retired at a much earlier age than I had expected. I thought I was much too home to sit home and do nothing, and so I asked myself what parts of my work had I most enjoyed. The answer that came back was research and writing. This photo was taken at the National Women's Conference in Houston in 1977, which was held 4 years after I graduated from college. I decided to explore the life of the woman shown at left, whose name was Ellie Peterson. I grew up in Michigan, and my parents were moderate Republicans. My mother loved watching televised congressional hearings and political conventions. In 1964, when I was 13, I was watching the Republican National Convention, and I was astounded to see network news correspondents interviewing a woman. It was Ellie Peterson. That year, Peterson became the first woman to address a national political convention in prime time. She was serving in the top job then available to a woman in the Republican Party, and she was running against Phil Hart for the U.S. Senate seat from Michigan. A year later, she became the first woman to chair a state Republican organization when George Romney recruited her to lead the Michigan Republican Party in the wake of Barry Goldwater's disastrous defeat. I think I took note of Peterson because it was so rare to see a woman on the national political stage back then, and I was proud that she came from my home state of Michigan. During my college years, she became one of the Republican leaders in the National Women's Political Caucus, and throughout the 1970s, I continued to follow her career. Later in the 1990s, I got to know Peterson when she moved into the same senior community in North Carolina where my parents lived. My mother always told me she had very interesting stories to tell about her time in politics. So I decided to approach Peterson about writing a book about her life. I told her I was open to writing a biography or helping her write her own memoir. It turned out she had already self-published a memoir about her life for her family, and one of her proteges was working on a biography. But the woman had developed a chronic disease, and Peterson thought she wasn't making much progress. She suggested I contact her friend, and when I did, the woman was grateful to be able to hand off the project to me. One of the reasons I was attracted to writing about Peterson's life was that I discovered she had donated all of her papers to the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan, and so it would give me a reason to travel back to Ann Arbor to do my research. But as I approached this project, I began to doubt myself. Was Peterson worthy of a full-length biography? One of the things that inspired me to keep going was when I came across a column that my former Washington Post colleague, David Broder, wrote about Peterson in 1970, when she was stepping down as chairman of the Republican National Committee. It was then the top job that a woman could hold in the party. I'm sure many of you either knew David personally or would remember his columns in the Post. David wrote, "It is, I think, accurate to say that her abilities would have earned her the national chairmanship were it not for the unwritten sex barrier both parties have erected around that job. Certainly her organizational talents made her views as respected and her advice as sought after among her colleagues in the party as anyone in the past decade." David went on to write, "One basic problem all talented women face is the tendency of the parties to shunt them off to some preserve of Tea Party irrelevancies called women's activities. Mrs. Peterson fiercely resisted stereotyping and by sheer energy and capability won her right to operate at the full range of her talents. So after reviewing David's assessment, I decided to proceed. Peterson was then 91 and living near a niece in Colorado. I spent a few days interviewing her in person, and we continued to correspond as I worked on my book. I sent her chapters as I finished them. She said it was like I was giving her life back to her. She pointed out errors if she found them, but did not try to control my overall approach. I was happy that I was able to reconnect her with some old friends with whom she had lost touch. And I was only sorry that I was not able to finish the book before she died, 2 days after Hillary Clinton withdrew from the 2008 presidential race. Peterson had been a strong Clinton supporter, but in her last days, she had been interested in finding out more about Barack Obama. After about 6 years of work, my book was published in 2011. Peterson had no children of her own, but she came to be known to mother to many of her political colleagues and proteges, and we worked that idea into the subtitle of my book. Her proteges included former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman, former Federal Trade Commission member Patricia Bailey, and John Martilla, who ran the earlier presidential campaigns of John Kerry and Joe Biden. Peterson was the first woman to break into the group of all-male Republican state party chairmen. This photo is from 1969, when there were actually 2 women serving as state party chairs. You get a sense of what she was up against when you look at this photo. There is a similar photo in Katharine Graham's autobiography, when she was the only woman serving on the board of directors of the Associated Press at about the same time. A couple of reflections on Peterson's life and its relevance for today. As the Republican Party moved to the right, Peterson eventually left the party and considered herself to be an independent. She was very upset when the party abandoned its longtime support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Back in the mid to late 1960s, she had implemented programs to try to attract more women and blacks to the Republican Party's ranks. In the first years of the Nixon administration, she had also worked to get more women appointed to high-level administration posts. But by 1970, she was totally frustrated. She told a reporter, quote, "I never spoke about the doors that were closed to me. Too many women worry about not being at the head table. I always figured that if I was not invited to a strategy meeting, it was their loss. But I'm not sure. I'm getting awfully weary of maintaining that attitude. I'm getting weary of the discrimination against women in all kinds of political life." Peterson often recalled how Michigan Governor George Romney would introduce her by saying, "She thinks like a man." Romney, she recalled, thought he was being kind, but for years it was like waving a red flag in my face, and I always answered as politely as I could, "I think like men think they think." In 1976, Peterson served in a high-ranking job in Gerald Ford's presidential campaign, but she was also recruited along with her friend Democrat Liz Carpenter to serve as co-chair of ERA America, a coalition of women's groups that were working to try to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This era has been the subject of a new miniseries called Mrs. America, which features Cate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly. The series is now streaming on Hulu on FX. Of course, not every feminist could be covered in the 9-hour TV series. Still, I was disappointed that Peterson and Carpenter were not included as characters in the script. Actually, in 1967, Peterson and her moderate allies had succeeded in blocking Schlafly's election as president of the National Republican Women's Federation. However, it may have been a case of winning the battle but losing the war, because in the wake of her defeat, Schlafly left the Federation, took the mailing lists of her supporters, and started the Phyllis Schlafly Report and later the Eagle Forum. The mini-series does cover the National Women's Conference and how Schlafly eventually positioned herself as the face of opposition to the ERA. Peterson and Carpenter were specifically recruited to provide a public counterweight to Schlafly. At the time, they were viewed as safe, moderate political pros, who had a lot of chits they could call in because of their years of work in the political trenches. Peterson clearly viewed Schlafly as her nemesis and would have agreed, I think, with the overall thrust of the miniseries. At a women's conference in Michigan in 1983, scheduled just after the ERA ratification deadline passed, she said of Schlafly, quote, "an opportunist, a born loser until she could identify against her own sex, unable to get elected to Congress, unable to get elected to head the Republican women, unable to get on advisory boards for the conservative presidential candidates, unable to get a good Washington appointment, or any appointment for that matter. Then came ERA. It gave her a chance to shine, and the media helped make her the grand dame of negativism. But an interesting sidelight, her little band of women against women never grows. It's Phyllis who appoints the regional and state leaders. It's Phyllis who does the national press things. It is Phyllis who collects the money, makes no accounting, runs the show." Ironically, Peterson and Schlafly shared some things in common. They both were born in the Midwest. They both ran for Congress, although under different circumstances. They were both good public speakers and born political organizers. But as Peterson noted, one major difference was the extent to which they mentored others. The miniseries creates a fictional protege for Schlafly because she didn't seem to have any real life ones. This past January, Virginia finally voted to ratify the ERA, becoming the 38th state to do so. 2 years earlier, I had traveled to Richmond to lobby for the amendment. I took my granddaughter with me since she was a constituent of the Republican legislator we were visiting. Being a grandmother, I had to find a way to work in a photo of my grandchild into this presentation. Lucy's wearing a political button that shows a little girl with the caption, "Not one more generation." As I sat I sat with her on my lap that day, it was sobering to me to realize that I was now older than Peterson had been when she was recruited to co-chair ERA America and was described as silver-haired and matronly looking. It was also a stark reminder of how long some of these battles have been going on. I was happy that Peterson lived long enough to see women elected as governor and senator for Michigan. And in 1997, a majority of the judges on the Michigan Supreme Court were women. But I'm also grateful that she did not live long enough to see the state of our politics today. As far as she was concerned, our partisanship and lack of civility was bad enough during her own lifetime. While I was working on my book about Peterson, I often attended a monthly brown bag lunch that was organized by women staff members at the Library of Congress to support writers who were interested in women's history. At one of those gatherings, someone mentioned that later that day, a historian named Catherine Kish Sklar was going to speak at the Woodrow Wilson Center about her new book based on the letters of the reformer Florence Kelley. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Kitty Sklar had been my thesis advisor at Michigan, and it had been nearly 40 years since I had seen her. So I went to the book signing. It was wonderful to see her again and to meet her second husband, historian Tom Dublin. While Kitty signed books, I began regaling Tom with stories about what had happened at Michigan during the days when I had studied with Kitty. Tom and Kitty were co-editors of a scholarly website called Women in Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000. The goal of the website is to teach students how to work with primary documents to examine historical questions about women's history. Tom told Kitty about our conversation, and the next thing I knew, they were asking me if I would be willing to do a documents project about the episode that Kitty and I had lived through, which was known around the University of Michigan as the HEW complaint. It was wonderful to be able to return to the Bentley Historical Library and plunge back into those times. Enough years had passed that all of the files of the university's administrators and deans were now available for public inspection. Enough years had passed that some of the key women had passed their own papers on to the library. I also discovered that over the years, women had conducted oral histories with women faculty members from that time, giving them the chance to share what they had encountered. I wanted to find a way to bring their stories out of the library's file boxes. I finished my documents project in 2013. I knew that 2020 would mark not only the 50th anniversary of the complaint, but also the 150th anniversary of the admission of women to Michigan. I began to think about expanding my project into a full-length book. But in the meantime, I became intrigued by the story of another unknown woman. That woman was named Emily Hale. She had taught speech and drama at several American women's colleges and private schools and was a talented amateur actress. The poet in question of my title was the Nobel Prize-winning poet T.S. Eliot. For more than 2 decades, I've been part of a small women's group through my church in Arlington that meets monthly to discuss a topic of the hostess's choosing. About 6 years ago, our hostess said that when she was in college, she had loved a particular poem that Eliot had written, and she wanted us to read it and discuss it. The poem was Burnt Norton, the first of the Eliot poems that were eventually published under the name Four Quartets. I had studied the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in high school, but the last literature course I had taken was when I took 2 semesters of great books during my freshman year at Michigan. So I Googled Burnt Norton to find the poem online, and that led me to its Wikipedia entry. It explained that Burnt Norton was an abandoned manor that Eliot and Hale had visited in the 1930s. The next sentence piqued my curiosity. Even though Eliot was married, he spent a lot of time with Hale and might possibly have become involved with her had he not been married. Even after their time at Burnt Norton, Eliot stayed in close correspondence with her and sent her many of her poems. I did not know much about Eliot's poetry, but I did know that he had been married twice. So who was this Emily Hale, I wondered, and how did she fit in between Eliot's 2 wives? As I started to explore that question, I quickly learned that over the course of their lifetimes, Eliot had written Hale more than 1,100 letters. In 1956, Hale had donated them to the Princeton University Library with the provision that they could not be opened up until 50 years after the latter of their 2 deaths. Eliot died in 1965 and Hale died in 1969. Princeton later announced that the letters would be opened on January 2nd, 2020. I became determined to try and tell Emily Hale's story before then. You'll recall my long ago interest in Zelda Fitzgerald, the woman behind another great writer. Some have asked why I didn't wait until Emily Hale's letters were open. I suppose one reason was that at this time in our lives, 5 years can seem like a long enough time to delay. Another reason was that along the way, I learned that Eliot had arranged for Hale's letters to be destroyed, so I knew we would never fully know her side of the story. But I was still determined to capture her story as best I could. I had published some novels earlier in my career, so I had some experience with fiction. I had also enjoyed more recent novels such as The Paris Wife and Loving Frank. Again, the fictional stories of little-known women behind famous men. Some writers choose to write fiction to explore particular themes or to engage in so-called alternative history. In my case, I wanted to try to remain as close to the facts as I could, while recognizing that there were gaps in the lives of Eliot and Hale that I would have to invent. Hale actually turned out to have lived a very interesting life. She was very discreet about her relationship with Eliot, and I think her skill as an actress was one reason they were able to keep their relationship secret for as long as they did. Eliot fell in love with her in about 1912 when he was a graduate student at Harvard, before he left for a year's study at Oxford. While in England, he shocked his family and friends by his sudden decision to marry an Englishwoman named Vivian Haywood. His marriage turned out to be very miserable. He and Hale reconnected in the 1920s, and she started saving his letters in October 1930. Their correspondence and visits with each other continued until 1957, when Eliot married for the second time. As I began my research, I was forced by my personal circumstances to do much of it from home. This underscored for me how much easier historical research is now when you can use the World Wide Web than it was when I was in college. I also recognized that I had easy access to more materials than many earlier Eliot biographers did. I could review reviews of Hale's acting performances in searchable online newspapers from all across the country. Yearbooks and alumni publications were also online from many of the places where she had taught. With Google and Wikipedia and online genealogical records, I could track down many details about her famous friends and family members. I was eventually able to visit some of the places where she had lived and worked, but I could also find photographs of others online. And it turned out that the research I had done on the Flappers back when I was in college helped me understand the world in which she had lived during the 1920s. The last place Hale taught was at Abbott Academy, which is now part of Phillips Andover Academy outside of Boston. This photo is from one of the school's publications at the time she retired. Through its archivist, I got connected to several of its alumni, women who are now close to 80, who are among the last of Emily Hale's students. In 2018, they invited me to speak about my research at their 60th reunion. Their memories were important to my research because Hale had been teaching and directing them at a key point in her relationship with Eliot. But I ran into some hurdles along the way. Eliot's former publishing company has been publishing his collected letters, but the volumes have only been completed up through 1938. If a researcher wants to even read one of his unpublished letters in the collections at Harvard, you have to get permission from the Eliot estate. I also had to secure permissions and pay licensing fees for the Eliot poetry I wanted to quote in my book, and all of that took more time than I had expected. But I was thrilled when my book was in fact published at the start of this year. After 5 years of work, I decided I had to be at Princeton when the letters were finally opened on January 2nd. Again, because of the stipulations of the Eliot estate, you can only read the letters at Princeton, and you can't make copies of them. His editors are now working on a new compilation of these letters, but they will not be published until 2022. Current plans are to put them online. The Princeton librarians did not know how much of a stampede, as one of them called it, to expect on opening day. In fact, there were 6 researchers, all of them women, and 2 male reporters who were based in New York but working for English newspapers. It turned out that the story was a bigger deal in England than it was in the United States. Although Eliot was born in St. Louis and educated at Harvard, he became a British citizen in the late 1920s and lived in England for most of his remaining years. For Eliot's scholars, the letters were worth waiting for. Not only did Eliot pour out his passionate feelings for Hale, he also provided details of what had inspired many of his works. Frances Dickey of the University of Missouri, one of the country's leading Eliot scholars, was sitting next to me that first day. I later asked her to characterize for me what she had discovered when she began reading the letters. She responded, quote, "For nearly a century, critics have been laboring to unearth the literary, religious, philosophical, and cultural sources of Eliot's words and ideas. Much of this scholarship remains valid, but it seems distinctly less significant in light of what Eliot himself writes about his own poetry in his letters," unquote. In the letters, Eliot revealed his true feelings about many of his contemporaries and family members. The letters also corrected some aspects of the Hale-Eliot relationship that earlier biographers got wrong. After I began reading them, I created a section on my website to correct some of the things that were wrong in my novel based on those earlier books. Later that first morning, Harvard University's Houghton Library dropped a bombshell of its own. It released a letter Eliot had written in 1960 with instructions that it be made public when Emily Hale's letters finally were unveiled. Eliot's letter was shockingly nasty in its tone, disavowing that he had ever loved Hale and saying that if he had married her, it would have killed the poet in him. It went on to stipulate that they never had sexual relations and that he had in fact arranged for all of Hale's letters to be destroyed. Eliot's 1960 letter ended with a sort of over-the-moon declaration of his love for his second wife, Valerie Fletcher, his one-time secretary who was 38 years younger than he was. Eliot's letter was so counter to the words of the letters we were reading that it was hard to understand what made him write it. We concluded that he had feared his second wife might still be alive when Hale's letters were opened and wrote it to try to protect her. Valerie Elliott did in fact tightly manage her husband's literary estate for many years, but she died in 2012 at the age of 86. Eliot could not have anticipated that his letter from the grave would arrive in the middle of the Me Too movement and actually generated more media coverage for the opening of Hale's letters than if he had chosen to ignore them. Because I focused on researching Hale's history rather than interpreting Eliot's literary works, I've been gratified that Eliot scholars have invited me to write and talk about the details I've learned about Hale's life. Last month, I participated on a panel for the annual conference of the International T.S. Eliot Society. Although the Princeton Library is still closed, I was able to review and transcribe many of the Eliot letters, and I'm now hoping to write a more traditional biography of Emily Hale because she's now the focus of much more scholarly interest. Back in 2018, when I was polishing up my manuscript about Emily Hale, I was still thinking about my time at the University of Michigan and that other book I still wanted to write. 2020 was getting closer and closer, and if I was going to get it done, I had to make the commitment. I went back to my editors at the University of Michigan Press. I was gratified that they were very enthusiastic about the project and worked hard to get the book published by the middle of this year. Some of the women I subsequently interviewed were surprised that the university's in-house academic press was willing to publish the book, because in the years since then, the University of Michigan has fought for affirmative action all the way to the Supreme Court. 50 years ago, it fought just the opposite. My story actually begins at the University of Maryland, where a woman named Bernice Sandler had just earned a doctorate in psychology in 1969. Her department was expanding, but she was frustrated when she was passed over for any of the new jobs. She asked a friendly male colleague to help her understand what her problem was. "Let's face it," he said, "you come on too strong for a woman." Sandler recalled it was the final phrase that really stung her. Shortly after that, another researcher spent most of Sandler's job interview explaining to her that he couldn't hire a woman because when her children got sick, she would need to stay home. By that point, Sandler's children were teenagers. Then a counselor at an employment agency looked at her resume and said Sandler was not really a professional, but just a housewife who went back to school. Sandler's husband was supportive and told her she was a victim of sex discrimination, a term she said she had never heard before. But she knew she had been a victim of an injustice, and she set out to find a remedy. She was shocked when she learned that academic women had been excluded from the protections of the key civil rights laws of the 1960s, largely to achieve their passage. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 exempted professional and executive women. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 excluded employees, quote, in their educational activities. And Title VI, which barred many forms of discrimination in federal programs, did not include discrimination based on sex. Sandler continued to do her research. One day she was reading a report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and turned to the back to check out a footnote. It explained that in 1967, President Johnson had expanded a Kennedy-era executive order that barred federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race to now include sex discrimination. She described it as a eureka moment because she realized that every major U.S. university was a federal contractor and that this would give women the tool they needed to challenge sex discrimination on their campuses. But Sandler wasn't a lawyer, and she wanted to make sure she had interpreted this correctly. so she telephoned the U.S. Department of Labor. She was eventually transferred to the deputy director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. He was a lawyer named Vincent Macaluso, and he told Sandler, "I've been waiting for someone to call me." Behind the scenes, Macaluso secretly guided Sandler on how to file a complaint and what she should do to support it. Because Macaluso was a civil servant, it was many years before Sandler felt she could reveal his identity and how he had secretly helped her. On January 11th, 1970, Sandler filed the first of dozens of complaints she would eventually lodge against U.S. colleges, this one against Maryland. She did it under the umbrella of a professional women's organization called the Women's Equity Action League, or WEAL. Macaluso had told her it would help if she had a title, so she signed the complaint as chairman of WEAL's Action Committee on Federal Contract Compliance. She later acknowledged that it was a committee of one. As I began working on my book in early 2019, I was struck by an interesting parallel to our own times. 2 days before Sandler filed her complaint, women testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee to oppose President Nixon's nomination of G. Harold Carswell to the U.S. Supreme Court. This marked the first time a potential Supreme Court nominee was challenged on the basis of positions he had taken in a case involving sex discrimination. Like a handful of later nominations to the court, the Carswell nomination galvanized women at the grassroots level. Around the country, women began organizing local chapters of a group called Focus on Equal Employment for Women to lobby their senators to reject the nomination. In Ann Arbor, the group was organized by a woman named Jean King. King had earned bachelor's and master's degrees in history at Michigan and had worked in a variety of clerical jobs around the university. In her 40s and with 3 children at home, she was one of only 10 women to earn law degrees in the Michigan Law School's class of 1968. King was a bit older than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but things hadn't changed that much in American law schools in the 10 years since Ginsburg had graduated. Over the previous decade, King had become active in the Democratic Party, and now she gathered a small group of her friends to work to defeat the Carswell nomination. A few months later, the Senate did indeed vote to reject it in the face of widespread opposition. Meanwhile, Sandler was doing what she could to publicize her strategy and support women who wanted to file complaints against other universities. She was lucky when a short article appeared in the Saturday Review and it published her address, so women were able to contact her to get help. By May, she had filed complaints against 43 universities. King met Sandler in New York at the organizational meeting of a nationwide group called the Professional Women's Caucus. She returned to Ann Arbor and contacted the other members of Focus to see whether they would let her file a complaint in the name of their group. Then she dug in to do the work. King had several advantages that women on other campuses she did not. She had observed discrimination at Michigan for many years, but she was no longer a student or employee of the university, so the university couldn't retaliate against her. Women faculty members who challenged their colleges during this era were frequently denied tenure or otherwise encouraged to move on. Because of her activism in the Democratic Party, King also was savvy about politics and media coverage, and she worked hard to get support from members of Congress and sympathetic journalists. King had majored in history, and she knew how the aspirations of women and minorities had often collided over the course of American history. She later said that if the Black Action Movement strike had not been resolved, she would not have filed her complaint the following month because she did not want the university to set up Blacks and women to compete against each other. The complaint was also supported by the research of a graduate student named Kathleen Shortridge, who was taking a seminar in investigative journalism. Shortridge's findings were published in a lengthy story in the Daily that spring. The story appeared under a provocative headline that used the N-word to describe women's role at the university, making a play on a recent quote by the artist Yoko Ono. Shortridge's expose uncovered the male-female admissions quota that I referenced earlier. The women determined that out of the 900 professors then teaching in the university's largest unit, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, only 34 were women. Across the university, only 6.6% of professors were women. But if you excluded the School of Nursing, that number dropped to 5.3%. Even in other disciplines like education that had traditionally attracted more women, only 6 out of the 100 professors in that school were women. But the complaint went beyond the classroom. Michigan actually had employed more women than men in non-teaching roles, but they were relegated to the lowest paying jobs. Many of these women also complained that they were expected to do the work of managers and business professionals, but were not being compensated for it. The university viewed many of them simply as student wives who would soon be moving on to a new campus with their husbands. King recruited a Republican feminist whose late husband had been a law school administrator to co-sign their complaint. Following Sandler's strategy, they sent copies to the media rather than university officials. When reporters called university officials for a comment in response, Sandler later explained, sometimes they would say things they shouldn't. The complaint was sent to then Labor Secretary George Shultz in May 1970. Because it involved a university, the Labor Department turned it over to what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to pursue. Macaluso had advised Sandler that it was important to enlist the support of members of Congress to keep pressure on the agencies. As it turned out, both departments changed their cabinet secretaries at that time, so King and her Republican co-signer ended up sending 4 rounds of letters, more than 80 in all, to members of the Michigan congressional delegation. That summer, Eliot Richardson was nominated to the first of his 4 cabinet posts as Secretary of HEW. One of the key questions I wanted to spend more time researching for my book was the extent to which university presidents had lobbied Richardson to get him to relax his department's enforcement efforts. Richardson donated his papers to the Library of Congress, and I was happy to discover that he had had a secretary keep transcripts of his telephone calls. I could also review all of his appointment books and other files. Over the summer of 1970, Sandler helped Congresswoman Edith Green stage several days of congressional hearings to help bring the problem of sex discrimination to light. By then, Sandler had helped file complaints against about 100 universities. The transcripts of the hearings were subsequently compiled, printed, and distributed widely by Green and Sandler. Sandler said the hearings did more than anything else to make sex discrimination in education a legitimate issue. Among other things, she reported that in the fall of 1969, the University of North Carolina had admitted half of the men who had applied, but only 1/4 of the women. And as you may know, it was not until later that fall that the University of Virginia admitted its first undergraduate women. At the hearing, Sandler summed up what she described as, quote, the rather odd and illogical reasoning through which women were being denied admission to graduate and professional programs. She said, if a woman is not married, she'll get married. If she's married, she'll probably have children. If she has children, she can't possibly be committed to a profession. If she has older children, she is too old to begin training. Now, it is true that she may very well marry. Many of her fellow male students will do likewise. She may very well have children. Men also become parents, but we do not as a society punish them by limiting their professional development and professional opportunities. That August, at the urging of many members of the Michigan congressional delegation, HEW sent an investigative team to Ann Arbor. Here, the chief investigator, Clifford Minton, second from left, is shown in a happy photograph shot by the university's public relations department. King alerted a woman reporter at the Detroit Free Press who interviewed Minton as he was leaving his hotel room. Based on his quotations, King complained to HEW officials and members of Congress that Minton did not really understand the nature of campus sex discrimination because he had spent most of his career addressing racial discrimination in other settings, such as the building trades and factories. HEW agreed to send another team to investigate. One of those investigators was a young lawyer named Esther Larda. She went on to teach at Georgetown University Law School and founded the Pro Bono Institute. A few years ago, women in the American Bar Association set out to capture the memories of legal pioneers like Larda. In interviews about a decade ago, she recalled that she was, quote, appalled by what she and her fellow investigators had found at Michigan. Quote, I don't think any of us sort of realized how intense this was, how accepted it was, how widespread it was. Women were clearly not taken seriously. They were not viewed as peers. What we would do is literally go through people's credentials, and the credentials would be identical to a man, and they would be seen as second rate or innately presenting problems and obstacles and that sort of thing. It was exciting because this had never been done before. We literally created the model for how the review went. Women were there in greater numbers and women were applying in greater numbers. And it was just a different kind of discrimination, but it had an intensity to it that was very strong. When I thought about doing civil rights work, I'd always thought about it in terms of race. We have such a horrible history that is pernicious and lingering. To this very day, obviously, racism in this country. But there was a kind of viciousness about this that was really disturbing, unquote. 2 months later, in October 1970, HEW told the university that its team had found wide-ranging instances of sex discrimination. Among other things, it found that the admission of women to doctoral programs lagged behind the numbers who had earned master's degrees, and the number of women being hired as faculty lagged behind the number who had earned doctorates. It also found many instances in which the university's anti-nepotism rules, university's anti-nepotism rules had served to discriminate against women whose husbands were also faculty members. HEW told President Fleming that if the university did not respond appropriately within 30 days and amend its existing affirmative action plans to include women, then HEW would begin withholding federal contracts. A month later, it made good on that threat. King and her supporters were thrilled when the federal agency got tough, but they were upset when they learned that the first contract to be withheld was one that was going to provide family planning consulting services to the government of Nepal. More so than many universities, the University of Michigan did acknowledge that HEW had found instances of sex discrimination, but it refused to release those findings, which angered many women on campus at the time. Further, as secretaries began leaking their bosses' mail, it became known that the university presidents were joining forces to lobby top HEW officials to relax their demands. As the end of 1970 approached, more federal contracts were jeopardized. Although it was not disclosed at the time, it appears that UM officials fear the catastrophic effect that withholding more contracts would have on the college's finances. They ultimately accepted most of HEW's demands, but continued to argue that HEW had no jurisdiction over graduate school admissions because graduate students could not be considered employees. As I mentioned before, during these years, Robin Fleming was one of the country's most prominent college presidents because of the way he had successfully managed student protests. There is some evidence that Fleming and other University of Michigan officials wanted to take the lead in working things out with HEW because they were concerned that other colleges might make concessions to the federal government that they were unwilling to. One thing that Fleming did do was to create a commission on women, which annoyed King and many other activists because Fleming picked its members and it was viewed as mere window dressing to try to placate HEW. But over the next few years, the commission became an instrument for identifying issues involving sex discrimination and working to address them. Its first chairman was Barbara Newell, shown here in the foreground. Newell was a close aide to Fleming, who went on to become president of Wellesley and later chancellor of the Florida State University system. I was thrilled to be able to spend 2 hours interviewing Newell a year ago when she passed through Northern Virginia as she was about to celebrate her 90th birthday. I don't want to give away my whole book, but suffice it to say that while many of the stories in Conquering Heroines are inspiring, there are also some very sad ones. There were several women faculty members who pursued individual complaints of sex discrimination, but were often rebuffed by the males who then led their departments or controlled promotion and salary decisions. Several of these women left Michigan in frustration and became academic superstars elsewhere. Many of their marriages broke up. Change, when it happened, did not occur overnight. Title IX was passed in 1972. Edith Green encouraged feminists not to lobby for the legislation so that no one would notice what it was going to do. It took a while for people to realize what impact that law would have, and HEW did not get around to issuing the regulations to implement it until 1978. It took another 15 years after the complaint was filed before Michigan appointed a woman vice president. But eventually there was a time when it had a woman president, Mary Sue Coleman, and a majority of the Board of Regents were women. By 2008, women earned a majority of doctoral degrees in the United States, and in 2017, American women surpassed men in the numbers attending law and medical schools, including those at Michigan. But salaries still lag. Last month, the Northeastern Regional Office of the Labor Department's Office of Federal Contract Compliance announced settlements with Princeton and Yale to correct disparities between the salaries of certain male and female faculty members. In the case of Princeton, the settlement involved nearly $1.2 million and more than 100 women faculty members. And sadly, sexual harassment still remains a problem. 50 years ago, women experienced it, even if they didn't yet have a name for it. During the time I was working on my book, the Michigan campus was rocked by the resignation of its provost and a longtime professor in the School of Music because of their sexual harassment of women. So I hope I've helped you understand what inspired me to tell these stories. Back in 1994, Jean King said, "Unless we record our history, it will be lost." Jean took pains to preserve her own history, as well as the history of this episode. She was very angry that Robin Fleming did not mention it at all in his own autobiography. Jean was an inspiration to me when I was young, and it became important to me to try to tell her story. I was glad that I was able to interview her while she could still share some of her memories. I was also happy that she was able to come to the Daily with me about 9 years ago when I participated on a panel of women journalists who had worked on the paper when we were in school. She could hear us tell our stories about our careers and what we had been able to achieve. A few years later, when the Daily was seeking donations to renovate its building, I made a gift, relatively small by University of Michigan standards, to name the women's restroom at the Daily after Jean, so that a plaque could be posted recalling her contributions. I know many of us are spending the days of the shutdown going through our own records and those of our families. So before you throw them out, I hope you'll think about where they might be donated and preserved. I know there are so many other unknown women whose stories deserve to be told. The women I've written about have helped me to put my own life into perspective. In 1985, when Charlotte, Michigan celebrated the life of its most famous resident on Ellie Peterson Day, Peterson noted that there were now women governors, senators, astronauts, and pilots. And then she said, "I tell myself that I was there when the door was open. And maybe that is enough for anyone's life, to be able to say you were there when the door was opened for someone else." Thank you.
Sara, thank you very much. That was extremely informative and engaging. So you certainly have the gift of journalism and telling a story. So thank you. If you want to pose questions for Sara, please do so on the Q&A icon there, and I will take a look and I'll pose the questions to Sara. Okay. And we do have a question here, Sarah. Why did Emily Hale donate to Princeton? Did she have a connection there?
Yes, and that's a good question. She was very close friends with a Princeton professor, Willard Thorpe, who founded the American Civilization program at Princeton. And his wife, Margaret Thorpe, was also an English literature scholar. Margaret Thorpe had been a friend of Emily Hale's from childhood. She and Willard Thorpe had met at Smith College, and so Hale had stayed in very close touch with them. The Thorpes actually were mutual friends of Eliot's, although later in life, after Eliot remarried, their friendship seems to have kind of fallen apart. But the Thorpes were very strong to encourage her to give them to Princeton and to be supportive of her. One of the things that became clear when the papers were opened, Eliot and his second wife had positioned Emily Hale's gift, even before the letters were opened, as sort of the gift of a vindictive woman, that she had done this to get even with Eliot. And when you read the letters, you realize that as early as 1930, Eliot was telling Emily Hale that it was important to him that their correspondence was preserved. He thought that might be given either to the Bodleian Library at Oxford or at Harvard, where his family has put most of the rest of his papers. And he told her, but they're your letters, you can do with them what you want. Hale had actually thought about asking Willard Thorpe to go through and cull out those parts of the letters that would be of most interest to literary scholars rather than the more personal things. As they got older and when she started to talk to Eliot about making her gift, I think she was doing this decision because, you know, their relationship had cooled a little bit. She was about to reach the maximum retirement teaching age at the school she was teaching at. And she was going to have to move and store the letters again. And so I think she was thinking, it's time to do something with them. And so Eliot knew about it, but what seemed to set him off and make him angry was some sense that the people at Princeton were already reading the letters. He was actually less concerned about people finding out about his relationship with Emily Hale than he was about many of the kind of nasty, gossipy things he had said about friends and actually family members. And he hoped that they would be hidden for 50 years until those people or their relatives that he knew had passed on. So that's why they're at Princeton. And
Gotcha. What was his personality like? Was he a vindictive person like that? I mean, they had such an ongoing relationship, you know, over their letters, and then all of a sudden he turned mean towards the end.
Yes, it's kind of disturbing. And one of the things that's puzzling, I was very interested to read the letters in 1956 and early 1957. When Eliot got married, he did it very suddenly. He kept it a secret. And so all of his closest friends, not just Emily Hale, were surprised by his decision. And so on the one hand, he was writing these letters to Emily Hale in late 1956. It was at Christmas time. He was thanking her for her Christmas present. He was, you know, signing the letter with, you know, an endearment and all. And then a few weeks later, he's marrying his secretary. And Hale and the Thorpes, their exchange of correspondence after that was preserved, and it was clear they were both shocked. And Hale wrote a letter that sort of said, well, he's just made clear, he's just like any ordinary man, you know, he's fallen for a much younger woman. The vindictiveness was surprising and disturbing as expressed in this 1960 letter. And I think it bothered a lot of the Eliot scholars because I think it was something new. And we sort of sat around and argued about it, these women who were up at Princeton. Some of us wondered to what extent his second wife might have been involved in dictating the letter. Others said, no, that wasn't the case. He was just wanting to protect her and so forth. So But it doesn't shine him in a very positive light. And I think, and particularly now that there are a lot more women scholars and younger scholars who still appreciate Eliot's poetry, but are looking at some of these, questions about his life more critically now.
Gotcha. I have a question here. How did Bernie Sandler and Jean King find each other?
Bunny Sandler was, it was at a time, and there was a lot of networking going on, and someone had thought that Sandler had made a visit to Ann Arbor because she did do a lot of traveling around the campus, but it appears that that was not correct. There was an organizational meeting of a group called the Professional Women's Caucus. It met for a few years and then I think dissipated. King was on their board. I guess I've read some of the organization's records in her papers. It held a press conference and this meeting in New York, and somebody at the gathering sort of said, well, why aren't there any women television cameramen? And one of the male cameramen who was there said, oh, because the equipment's too heavy, you'd never be able to carry it. Whereupon one of the tiny women who was fairly athletic went up and grabbed his camera and ran around the stage with it to show that, that was a fallacy, that they could actually carry the camera. And I think that was a moment that, women remembered in their oral history. Sandler, who I interviewed in Washington about 10 years ago, that was the story she recounted to me from that event. And
okay. Are there any other questions specifically about Sarah's talk? I have a question about who's next, Sara. Have you targeted a few women that you will be writing about?
Yes, I indicated I haven't fully finished off my itch to write about Emily Hale.
Okay.
Part because we're learning a lot more about her, and I think that there is now much more interest in her. There's still going to be some gaps. The thing that's frustrating when you read one of Eliot's letters, I loved when he would say, in your last letter you said such and such, because that's the only glimpse you got of her. It's still very unclear how they met, got reconnected in the 1920s. She began going over to England and vacationing, and they started to correspond. He arranged in his published letters, there's a reference to him telling one of his colleagues to please start the subscription to Emily Hale. And but it's one of the things I've mused about is how they were able to keep their relationship so secretive. She was the daughter and niece of clergymen. She grew up at a time where women of her background, were expected to be discreet. Her mother was institutionalized in a mental hospital from the time she was 5. And so I thought there was a lot in her background that you would not expect her to go out and write a tell-all novel. And she actually was very cagey about how she managed her own papers. When we got into the papers at Princeton, we discovered that not only had she put Eliot's papers in that collection, but she had also put letters that she had received from a handful of friends who knew about her relationship with Eliot. So again, it was another way of protecting Eliot for that half century. She has another set of her papers that are in the Smith College archive, and there's very little sign of Eliot in those papers. So it's an interesting contrast.
Kristen Cabral, who's on this, listening to this, said she's also a Michigan alumna, and she's not happy that Fleming signed her college degree as the interim president in the spring of 1988, because Harold Shapiro, Michigan's president for 7 of her 8 semesters, was not available because he had become Princeton University's president. So she's still harboring feelings that she wanted him to sign it.
Well, I guess, and I know Kristen, so it's good to have her on the call. That Fleming, as you can see, had a very good reputation, and I think he came back to Michigan. He actually served for a time as president of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the Carter administration. So he came to Washington. And then, you know, after a transition period, he went back to Ann Arbor. And so when they had this gap, they brought him in. I guess the search for the president was probably going longer than they had anticipated, or maybe Shapiro decided to take the job sooner. It's interesting. There are many men who have used the University of Michigan presidency as a stepping stone to the Ivy League, including Shapiro, Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia. I think James Duderstadt, one of the MIT presidents, came out of Michigan. Mary Sue Coleman had been president of University of Iowa and used that as her stepping stone to Michigan. Michigan has been a stepping stone for other women academics. Teresa Sullivan, who went to UVA, had been provost of Michigan. And Nancy Cantor, who I think is now president of Rutgers, was provost of Michigan. And so, you know, it's obviously a good school and a challenging one. And you know, so it's interesting how these careers happen. When Coleman arrived at Michigan, of course, I was thrilled that we had a woman president. She stayed there, I think, for a decade. And I hoped that she was not going to use it as a stepping stone to something else. And indeed, she stayed at Michigan up until the time she retired.
Gotcha. I have a question here, but I'm not sure what it is. So Marge Singer.
I know Marge too. So.
Oh, okay. Did the Michigan Daily play a big role in? Marge, can you chime in? Unmute. I can't read what it says.
It says your career as a historian and a writer.
Oh, in your, gotcha, career as a, so did the Michigan Daily play a big role in your career as an historian and writer, Sara?
Well, I think so. And I think Marge worked on the Daily too. So I know she probably agrees with me that it was a very intense experience. When you go to a large college like Michigan, you really need to find your niche. And I really felt I learned more about journalism through working on the Daily, you know, than through what was then the journalism department itself. I started off as a journalism major and actually got more interested in history. And so switched my major to history, but was able to do a double major in journalism. But I felt that my working on the Daily set me up for some of the summer internships I was able to get then. And it's an interesting place because it's independent from the university administration and any kind of teaching. So it's like it's really peers training peers. And, you know, there were, you know, so many of my, you know, friends. And I mean, I cited, you know, people like John Papanek, who went on, Sarah Krolwich, who went on to great careers. I mean, you know, feel so blessed to have worked with them, and that tradition, you know, has continued. And I think, though, that you know, history had the same appeal to me in journalism in terms of, you know, curiosity, wanting to tell the stories of people. I've reflected on, you know, why didn't I become an English literature major? And I think, you know, obviously I liked writing, but I liked writing about people or understanding people more than I liked, you know, studying and reflecting on works of literature and what they meant. So, but I think Marge would agree to me that the Daily was a great place for an education.
Okay. We have a suggestion for some other subjects that you could write on. Najla Druby suggests that you might want to write about the Squad, which is currently facing so much opposition in Congress. And then another candidate for your consideration could be Stacey Abrams.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that I would imagine that those books are already in the works. I will say that I probably have a preference for writing about people who are not so much on the center stage anymore. In some ways, I like to dig into records. One of the flip sides, negatives of that, though, is that when the people are no longer around or are, you know, in their final years, they may not be able to give you the same kind of help in marketing your book as you might like. You know, when I wrote the Ellie Peterson book, you know, by then the Republican Party had so moved on from what she had represented that, you know, they were certainly not interested in giving me any marketing help with it. And but certainly the people who remembered her and worked with her remembered her fondly, and that helped. And I was able to get some nice opportunities to speak, particularly back in Michigan, where, you know, people really remembered her well.
Kristen suggested you write about Jennifer Granholm.
Yeah. She's another good, of course, some of these women too, they're, you know, their careers are not necessarily over. You know, Granholm, who was Attorney General, then Governor of Michigan, she unfortunately cannot run for president because she was born in Canada, and because of our constitutional amendment, she's actually someone who could not do it, besides people who some people say, you know, that they aren't American citizens. She did have that barrier, but she, you know, a lot of these women are finding interesting things to do. And I think, you know, for all of us, you know, with longer life expectancies, and you can kind of take a step back. I mean, I think of like Sandra Day O'Connor, who after she stepped down from the court because of her husband's Alzheimer's, that she really decided she wanted to take on something to improve civics education. And I think it's a shame, you know, that she's had her own health issues now and can't continue that work, because I think it's critically important. But as people have some celebrity and they may not be running, you know, for public office anymore, I'm hoping that they can take their positive brands and contacts and things like that and still do important work that can help all of us, particularly, I think, in these next few years, when I think we're going to need a lot of that sort of thing.
Well, we're getting all sorts of rave reviews on your presentation here, Sara, so thank you for that. One last question before I let everybody go. What is your take on the Me Too movement?
Well, I think it's been very empowering for women. I think, again, it's women finding their voice and that they get strength in numbers. I think, you know, the Women's March right after Trump was inaugurated, I think was empowering in the same sort of way. I think it was important, and I think women realized though, that you can't just go out and protest. I think you see it in all these grassroots organizations that have grown up to support the political process. And I found in my own work on campaigns that you often don't know all that's going on out there, because particularly if you have kind of your focus on the traditional organizations, I think obviously Stacey Abrams, you know, her network down in Georgia apparently, you know, helped deliver that state for, you know, Biden, and have those Senate races, you know, be so close. And so again, I mean, it's one of the things I think Ellie Peterson realized is that, you know, women are willing to put in the grunt work if necessary to get these things done, because they know it's important and somebody's got to do it. I think of a lot of my friends who have chosen to write postcards over these years. They might not have felt they could do face-to-face canvassing, but this was something they still felt they could do and have an impact, you know, in a different way. So I think that women coming together is empowering, and I think it's one reason why women respond, and you know, like to the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, women who they can view as heroines and all are really empowering, and they want to share those stories with younger women. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write my Michigan book, is because, you know, a lot of young women don't realize how recently, I mean, a half century isn't yesterday, but it seems like only yesterday to those of us, you know, who are of a certain age, how different the world was. And it's easy to forget that. And it's also easy to say, you know, if you let down your guard about these things, it could return to those kinds of times.
Well, everything we're reading here is thank you so much. How interesting. Somebody just posted just a big exclamation point to your presentation. So Sara, this is very educational and interesting and absorbing for all of us. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you to all of you for being here today, and particularly